Hi everyone, it's great to have you all tuning in today for another interview in our Quantum Conversation series. I'm Diya Nair, the UK ambassador, and today we're delighted to have Madisson join us. Dr. Madisson Coke is a senior experimental officer with a specialism in material science. After obtaining a master's in chemistry from Imperial College, she moved to the London Centre for Nanotechnology at UCL to complete a PhD on the electronic properties of zinc oxide and related materials grown by molecular beam epitaxy. After successfully obtaining her PhD, she then went on to work as an experimental officer at the National Graphene Institute at the University of Manchester, focusing on plasma deposition, and following this, she joined the Photon Science Institute to work as a senior technical specialist for nanoscience advanced material engineering, with a focus on atomic scale manipulation and detection, from applications ranging from quantum computing to topical insulators. Thank you for joining us, Madisson. It's amazing to have you here today to share your experiences and knowledge. So, to start off with, we're going to have a little look at your journey as a scientist. So, our listeners would love to hear, what is your earliest memory exploring STEM? What is the memory that allowed you to think, this is what I want to do in my life?
So, like, one of my earliest memories in STEM was actually my parents taking me to an observatory, and it was during school holidays. So they kind of went to an exhibition, and I realised that it wasn't all about stars. It was actually a really well thought out exhibition that had everything from plastic, so you could go and make some thermosetting plastics and create some art with that, to Archimedes screw as part of their water demonstration. So, really hands-on science, which kind of brought science to me from something that is something you just learn about, with pens and papers and in the classroom, to something that was really hands-on, and could make a difference. For me, it was about being interactive, whilst learning as well. And obviously it wasn't in a school setting, it was in this kind of place that my parents had taken me to basically fill the time for the day. But it was something that showed me the breadth of science as well. It wasn't just kind of purely chemistry. Well, back when I was, in primary school, it's just science, but rather than just the science you learn about in the classroom, there were all these other types of science that, as a youngster, I didn't realize were also considered science. So I think that for me is my earliest memory of kind of exploring STEM and thinking that actually this is really cool, and it's something that I could really get into.
Oh, that's so nice. And I love the idea that having that hands-on experience is what kind of drove you to think that science is beyond just theory. And I think the kind of experimental aspects, the practicals in science are always so fun. And it really puts things into principle because you learn about a theory in class, but then when you carry out a practical and it all works out perfectly, it just feels so great. So it's really nice that you have that same feeling that I do. So talking about school, what would you say is your favorite subject while you were at school?
So I really enjoyed maths and science. So I'm dyslexic, so English and languages were actually really difficult for me. Anything with large amounts of text, I found really difficult to engage with. And it doesn't mean I didn't enjoy them as much, but it was a lot more difficult to engage in reading, a large book or reading out loud. And that was something that I struggled with throughout my kind of school career, from primary school and secondary school. Whereas maths and science, kind of looking at equations, and looking and kind of being more hands-on with the chemistry aspects later on in secondary school, to me that made a lot more sense, and I could engage with it a lot more, and I could take it in new places. So in my secondary school, we would often have kind of, we would have a week where we would have a maths challenge. So it wasn't so much just doing kind of learning how to do areas of circles and things. You were given a question and you had to answer it by the end. And you could go in lots of different areas. And I really enjoyed kind of exploring with maths and exploring with science generally. So science for me really kind of resonated with me. It was something that I really enjoyed early on. I have quite a logical brain as well. So that to me made a lot more sense, balancing equations in maths, but then also balancing equations in chemistry, and you've got balancing equations in physics. So there was this kind of balance and kind of logic to it that I really enjoyed, kind of moving through science. But that isn't say, dyslexia does play a part of my life generally. Sadly, you can't get away from reading literature or kind of having to engage in text. So that was always a struggle, but and still is. I have my mechanisms now, but yeah, growing up, I think that the science and math for me was something that I just really enjoyed, and would often kind of take experiments in new directions. And the main thing is also, I think, in those sorts of situations, and the creativity, but also asking why. I think scientists and mathematicians love to ask why, and that's how you delve into questions a lot more. So that's the bit that I enjoyed.
That's such a lovely answer, and how like science and maths shaped so many things. It starts from exploring. It starts with these basic equations, and you're just applying them. But then over time, as you delve deeper into science and maths, it's about thinking, where did this come from? Why is it the case? And yeah, that's what I love about the STEM fields as well. It's kind of being able to ask questions and find the solutions to them. It's just so methodical, and I feel like they have a real impact in the world as well, because it starts. I've said many times today, but it starts with the theory, but the applications are just so widespread throughout society that you could go anywhere with them. So I totally agree. Moving on to another kind of childhood memory. Who was your inspiration as a child?
So kind of not so much in science, just generally overall. There used to be a TV show on kids TV called Art Attack, and the person who presented it was called Neil Buchanan. And I really loved Art Attack. So I love being logical and and kind of asking why, but also I love being creative. And I think those things kind of go hand in hand, because you're asking why and you've got to come up with creative solutions, because if you come up with the same solution as everyone else, then that's not, you're not going to find the right answer. But for me, Art Attack, it was very hands-on. He was creating stuff all the time. He did these huge, massive art pieces, kind of that spanned a field or even larger. And then he'd come back to the studio. Maybe he'd do something small that you could do at home. And I enjoyed watching him. I enjoyed how interactive it was. He would do lots of, one thing I always remember, he did kind of art on a t-shirt, but then he used other materials and looked at how they interacted. So he used nail polish and saw how you could create it with a nail polish. He did it with acrylic paints, and then he kind of almost did like a mini experiment, but through art. And I really enjoyed everything about Art Attack and what it represented in being creative, but also just kind of exploring as well. It wasn't like you had to create a masterpiece of a hillside top. It was about kind of being, again, the hands-on element, and kind of doing things for yourself and creating. So as a child, I loved watching it, and I would say he was definitely an inspiration for me, for my creative outlets, and thinking slightly differently.
Oh, that's so sweet. And when I heard this TV show, it kind of gave me flashbacks to Mr. Maker, watching it as a kid. Um, and it's just, you said how important creativity is, and I totally agree. I think that sometimes when you do STEM subjects, you forget the importance of creativity, but then you are able to leverage it again through hands-on experiences. And then when you are able to kind of bring it all together, it feels so great. I kind of was feeling throughout my first year of A-level studies, I've not been being very creative. I've been answering a lot of past paper questions. In the summer, I had the opportunity to create academic posters and do research projects, and that really allowed me to lean more into my creativity and see how the two kind of come together. So that was really nice, and I completely agree with that. So I know you studied chemistry, but how was your university experience, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, so I studied at Imperial College London. I moved to London and studied a master's. It was a combined master's, so I did a master's in chemistry with a year in industry as well. So it was quite a long degree, but it meant it gave me a master's at the end and also a bit of industrial experience to kind of test that out and see how that was. I really enjoyed my university experience. For me, it was really eye-opening in relation to science, but also just life in general. I think you learn so much about yourself more than just a subject, from everything from budgeting. You have to work in teams, and that's working in teams in group projects. That's working in teams. I joined a hockey club. That's working in teams there. You know, new cities, new experiences. I think for me, the university experience was so varied and so important to me as to who I am now. And the one thing that I really, again, being really hands-on, I really enjoyed was Imperial College. From year one, you are in the lab at least once a week. So there are some universities that don't have much lab work, but I would, you know, if you want to get into a lab, then I would always suggest looking for a university that has this lab experience, because there is something changes where, you know, when you go from being in a classroom setting doing a lab with someone who's always there to doing a lab over, you know, you do experiment over a whole week. You're creating this one product that you then go and get analyzed. And that's really different, because you also have to manage your time, you have to manage your experiment. And the bit also at the end is we then could submit our chemicals to go and be analysed. I think that is also really important. So we actually got some of ours analysed by NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And it actually makes you feel like a bit of a scientist when you create something and then you send it off for analysis, and then you get a graph back and you're like, oh wow, like this is actually run on like a big system that will be able to tell me roughly what I've made. So that was really interesting, because that made you think that you're actually part of a kind of bigger area of research. And obviously I think, you know, you learn so much in those years. The amount of knowledge that I gained was huge in that time. And I think for me, so chemistry is kind of split up into organic chemistry, physical chemistry, and inorganic chemistry. And I really found that physical chemistry for me was the bit that I most enjoyed. I'm probably looking back, I think that if I'd had maybe a slightly different experience of physics in like my secondary school, maybe I would have gone into more physics kind of going forward. But physical chemistry for me was really interesting. Everything from kinetics of reaction to looking at kind of the quantum mechanics as well. So we had lots of different kinds of chemistry, and physical chemistry for me was the one that I enjoyed the most. So when I did my year in industry, I worked for GlaxoSmithKline for a year, and I worked in their physical chemistry area. So we were looking at solubilities of drugs and how they are transported through the body. So obviously when you take a drug, you need to get to the right place. So if it's not soluble in the right pH, then sadly it won't get to your brain, or it won't get to the gut, or depending on how you take it, also changes the way in which it needs to travel around the body. So I was with them for a year, and it was a really interesting year. It was very eye-opening to how some industries work, especially pharmaceutical companies. And afterwards I was like, actually, I want to probably stay. I really like the academic environment. In my final year, you do a project over the whole year. So that's, you know, taking that 1 year, the 1 week lab, and then expanding it over an entire year. You know, you kind of do lots of experiments to try and get a result. And I was like, actually, that resonated with me and was more interesting to me than the kind of working in the industry at that moment in time. So I decided that maybe kind of continuing academia was the way to go. But that year in industry was also so important, because you learn to work in a very, you know, you get put into a team of, back then I'd say, of adults, and I felt like, oh, okay, this is how adults work, and this is how, you know, you get integrated with that team and you see. And I came back with a very different perspective of my science than when I went in. So my university experience overall was so full, and I think that is also the thing, is just taking everything on board and doing as much as you can and enjoying it. But for me, it was a great introduction into science, and chemistry for me was a really, it made me very hands-on, but also made me realize that actually the physical chemistry and the maths and physics was something that resonated with me going forward.
That was such an insightful way to describe all your experience. Thank you so much. I loved how you went for a year in industry and the integrated masters because it allowed you to explore all the different outlets. You got to explore industry and academia, and then you found out what truly was your calling. And that's really nice. I think probably until that point in time, you won't have a lot of experience in both different sides. So then once you're able to explore both of them, then you can decide where you really want to go. When you did your PhD in chemistry, how did you find that experience?
Yeah. So I went to UCL, so travelled across London, but stayed in London to University College London, and then an institute there called the London Centre for Nanotechnology. And the interesting thing about institutes are that they are not a particular department, so they're not all materials or all physics or all chemistry, but every single project that goes through these institutes have to be a combination of different subjects. So you become more interdisciplinary, which is the more you learn in science, the more you realise everything is interdisciplinary, really, and you pull on lots of different strands to create the best kind of outcomes, really. So I did my PhD there, and that was looking at basically, I was growing new materials. I was growing some thin films, and then looking at how the current basically transports through the interfaces. And because it's the interface, it can be two-dimensional. And because we're confining it and it's two-dimensional, that means we can get quantum effects. So I was looking at the quantum Hall effect, where the current will travel in distinct multiple levels, when you apply a large magnetic field at low temperatures. So I was creating, making the materials, I was characterizing the materials. So obviously you have to know what you have, and then you make devices. So you make small contacts that you can add wires to, so you can measure current going through there at really low temperatures in a field. So I kind of took my materials from growth all the way to kind of materials and electronic characterization. So I kind of started interacting with quantum a little bit there, and looking at kind of definitely leaning more into the material side of things. So my boss, basically we call him a principal investigator. He was in electrical engineering, so he came from the electrical engineering side, and we had a materials focus on kind of what I was creating. From a science point of view, I think again your projects kind of become larger. So you kind of, from your undergrad, you do like these week-long projects, and then your final year of your masters, you'll do a year-long project. And this was, a 3-4 year project where you kind of have to look at short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals, and kind of guide it with the help of obviously your supervisor to get to the end goal. And I think that you learn so much about that particular field. So I came from chemistry and I kind of came into a very physics world. So also I realized what bits I didn't know, but everyone was really supportive in helping me learn that. And I think that's one thing going through my career is I have never stopped learning. You've always found bits that I didn't know, and I've had to either investigate myself that is out there, or do research to fill that gap because maybe no one knows that answer. So yeah, I think that was really interesting to guide that research. The difference between going from an undergrad to a PhD is, and a PhD, you don't necessarily know the answer. So in undergrad, generally, apart from that last year project, they know roughly what the answer is when you do an experiment, or when you get given a challenge. If it's in physics, if you're doing some derivations or something, someone knows what the end result is. When you start doing research, you do background, you do literature, you think you know a hypothesis of what you want to achieve, but then when you go and do it, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. So then you have to go back and realize, okay, what have I learned from that, and what can I do going forward to still achieve my goal? So I think that also builds in your resilience. You do have to be quite resilient when doing research, because there are definitely ups and downs. Things will work amazingly sometimes, and then reproducibility is also really important. So you have to make sure that you can do it again and again reproducibly. But then you learn other things, again, bigger things, generally about kind of science and how science works in research. So that might be in managing the time on the system. So as I came for my PhD, there were other PhDs who were starting, and I had, as this kind of senior PhD, I had to make sure I managed all the time on the project. So all of us got an equal amount of time to do our science on that, and also managing time and expectations, because some people are going to think that their science is the best thing ever, and you're like, okay, that's great, but we need to manage, this person also needs to be able to run their science, and also we need to manage the outputs that are going out. So we had to, and also the system will go down. I don't know any research system that has not had any downtime. So during my many years, we had a month or two where maybe we were trying to fix things with the suppliers. So you kind of have to balance all these things. So there is the science plate which was spinning, but you also have other plates to kind of consider as well in my PhD. But it was a really amazing time, and the flexibility of being able to do your own research was really, really amazing.
Research is completely just exploring, finding, making mistakes. And the point about resilience is so important. In science, it's something that everyone has to go through. There's going to be so many times when things don't work out. But yeah, I think resilience is one of the most important things as a scientist, as someone discovering new things. Every 50 times or so that it goes wrong, and where it goes well will be the greatest feeling. So it was amazing to hear. And you also talked about just learning new things. When you didn't have that much experience with the physics side of it, you learned, you explored. And I think just the feeling of continuous learning is just amazing, because there's always going to be something new in the world, something new, innovative, exciting that you can read about. And I think that's one of the greatest things about this field. There's always going to be something new and exciting to find out about. So you explained that this is kind of part of your career where you started to explore more about the quantum mechanics side of things. So what would you say is your first official encounter with the field of quantum?
I'd say probably kind of not in research, but kind of quantum as, kind of what is quantum. It would be the quantum mechanics when we were studying chemistry. So we learn a lot about particle in a box. So that is looking at basically standing waves of electrons in a box, and looking at how that quantizes it. And I think one of the main things that I learned from that is that everything is a simplification. We were looking at models, and the lecturer would be like, and the models actually in real life are so complicated. We're going to simplify this, this, and this, and make this, this, and this, and this assumption. And kind of then we can maybe model something that's close to it. So I think definitely kind of in my chemistry, this particle in a box, kind of looking at models of electron states, was the first introduction to this quantization, this kind of these levels that were set, and kind of how they interact and how they can affect things. I think was probably the first time that I got introduced to quantum as kind of what it was, rather than just a word that kind of struck not fear, but quantum sometimes, especially coming from a chemist, I was like, that sounds quite scary. But then kind of breaking it down and looking at some of those equations, some of them were still scary, but actually being able to understand them meant that I had a bit more of an understanding of what quantum was, rather than kind of just a kind of vague idea kind of in the future.
Really nice. You had a similar experience to one of our previous speakers who also studied chemistry, and their first experience was kind of learning it in a module of chemistry. So that's really nice. It's really interesting to see how many people can take a chemistry degree and then go on to merge with the more physics aspects of things. And I think that's really fascinating. I have a few friends who study chemistry, and they've always been really fascinated with physics as well. So it's kind of a really nice overlap between them. And I really enjoyed chemistry when I studied it. So I think it's a really fascinating subject, and it has a lot of different kind of applications. But that's just science in general. There's so much overlap. You learn one topic in physics, and then the next week you learn it in chemistry. It's all overlapping in such a great way, which is really nice. So that was kind of the first section of our interview, exploring how you got to your career, your education, and it was really nice to hear how you started with these childhood memories of exploring things, getting fascinated by them, and where you've reached now. So thank you so much. Now we'll be moving on to the current section of the interview. So the first thing we want is you kind of leaned into this a little bit earlier on in the interview. What particularly do you enjoy about research?
So I really enjoy about research is kind of being at the forefront of something, and pushing boundaries and asking why, and being creative about it. The thing that I mentioned before is, not everyone knows the answers to the questions that we're asking, or we're coming up with new innovative solutions to things that might already have a solution, but maybe we can do things a little bit better. And there are so many complex, different challenges out in the world at the moment that I think science can really help with. And I think that being part of the solution is actually a really, for me, very fulfilling thing. Creating new things and new solutions is really rewarding, and it's really rewarding on a kind of being part of the world, but also personally kind of being able to know that you created or researched or discovered something, and that doesn't need to be something, it doesn't need to be discovering the new wonder material that's going to change the world, but it might be improving something by 10%, and that 10% actually, if you improve something by 10% and that's over the whole world, that can be a huge amount. It might be smaller than that, but for me, I think it's about kind of being at that forefront, kind of discovering new things, pushing those boundaries. And also, I really enjoy the community. The community of researchers is generally a really nice one. I've had some really amazing people all over the world. I think that is another thing about the research community, is that it's not local. You have a local community, and then you have the community of all the universities over the UK, which we collaborate with. And then we have collaborators in Australia, in Canada, and kind of all over, in Germany, we're all over the world. And that's also really interesting, because I find, human connection and kind of those sorts of connections and the passage of knowledge around not just keeping it to yourself, but that interaction all over the world, locally and nationally and internationally, is also a really exciting thing. So I really enjoy that, being part of that big web of science as well. So I get a lot of fulfillment from what I do, and it makes me very happy. So that's kind of why I've kind of stuck with research.
Everything completely resonates with me. The idea of creating something and thinking that it brings change throughout the world, even if it's a small change, it has a great impact. And that feeling of community throughout the world, throughout the country, throughout a local scene, just those things sound so lovely. And it's really nice to hear that you found that. So why did you decide to specialize particularly in material science? You said that you really enjoyed physical chemistry, so leaning into that.
Yeah, so firstly, materials are everywhere, and material properties are everywhere. But the reason I kind of ended up there was because materials draws on so many of the different core science subjects, and it's really interdisciplinary. And I really enjoy that. There's a part of materials which is very making, it's very kind of creating, and then you characterize them. And materials goes from the nanoscale, which is kind of where I'm at, looking at kind of quantum effects and really localized kind of materials, up to the large scale. So you're looking at concrete, looking at buildings, looking at how things on a large scale, those kind of structures. So materials is such a broad subject that you can really go anywhere in it. So I've mainly stayed within the nanoscale kind of quantum areas, where we're looking at localization of either where the current will pass, or where we're manipulating our new material, a very localized, very nanoscale effect. And to me, that's really interesting, because it then does also draw on all of the different kind of aspects of chemistry and physics that I've had in the past. So I really enjoy it, because I think that it's got that creating aspect. I'm creating materials. I can't really pick them up with my hands, but I'm still creating something on the nanoscale. But then going on from there, I enjoy the characterizations of kind of really getting to know what I've made. And then hopefully then going on to do something really interesting with them. So quite often I'll make them and characterize them, and then someone else will do some of the kind of device fabrication now. So kind of that kind of areas. But I really enjoy it because I think that, you know, there is a lot of possibilities for creating new things. I think we need a balance of lots of different areas, so for materials, and but then you need to do something with materials. So you need other people who can create these amazing devices, and then other people who can interpret some of that data, because you know there's a massive data created in some of these devices. So you know, but for me, it kind of starts with creating that material.
I think that a lot of people can do overlook materials when in our everyday life. We think um, that's some concrete, but then the science behind all the materials to make them the way they are, to make the properties fit to purpose. I think the science behind it is so fascinating, particularly because mostly I mostly look at on things on the application level and main things like that. So kind of thinking about how does an electronic circuit, how would such like small basic things be able to create such complex systems, and the fact that it all starts from materials is so fascinating to me. So that's really amazing. And I loved how you discussed how it all works together, because I feel like it's all about collaboration. One person making something and the next person creating it and developing it, and then someone interpreting the data. Once you start something, it's just a journey throughout so many different people. And it's really interesting to hear. Thank you so much. So what is your typical day as an experiment?
Yeah, so I guess it's one of those things where because I have so many varied projects, there's not a typical day, but kind of typical tasks that I will do that isn't the science. You know, I'm managing some of the projects. I'm making sure the projects are running okay. There are meetings for the projects to get them underway, how they're going, and kind of their closing, writing reports, kind of there's a bit of management in there of other people and of the system, making sure that we collect the cost of the machine as well. So, you know, we can have some more in the future. But I'd still say about 75% of my time is actually sitting on my system doing science. So for me, that's really important because that's the bit that I really love. I really love actually doing this, the kind of the experimental work. And running actual samples through my machine that I run. So I really enjoy that part of it. But 75% of the time, actually on the system, I'd probably say maybe 15% of the time is troubleshooting. As I mentioned before, I don't know any research instrumentation that is up all the time, because there's always issues. Because when you're doing research and you're pushing boundaries with systems, that means that maybe the system that we have, it was the first one of its type in the whole world. So when you do things like that, there are always going to be issues, because we're always going to be tweaking it to try and make it a bit better. Or something might break that we didn't realize would break after 6 months or however long. So I think there's a lot of problem solving in that, as well as running new projects with other people. So there are problem solving when we're looking at the system, and then there's problem solving when you're looking at making the material as well. So people will come to you with an idea, but they won't know the kind of system that I'm using. And so they'll come with an idea, and you've got to kind of manage the expectation a bit as to what you can achieve. Sometimes it might be, we can do that, that's absolutely fine. Maybe have you thought about doing this as well, because maybe we'll get better results, or kind of that input as well into projects. And that's discussions with PhD students, that's discussions with postdocs, so that's the kind of position after PhD students, and lecturers as well. So it's kind of having that discussion to make sure we get the best out of all of the experiments. So there's a lot of discussion, but most of my time is still kind of physically making materials and characterizing the materials. And that's a bit that I love. So I think that's really interesting to me, and fulfilling. And I think that the other part of my job is, I mentioned already, there's meetings and stuff, communicating our results, but also communicating to the general public and the wider community, I think is really important, because materials, I don't think is a subject that is really brought up much, until people either know about it in research, or some people do it at university as well, but it isn't so much known about. So we kind of go to schools, we go to science fairs and take some demonstrations to kind of show materials as everything, all the way from building bridges to the nanoscale electronics that we create. So I do spend some of my time as well kind of going out into schools or going to science fairs, and that is also a bit that I really enjoy, because I get to think about and talk about my science in a different way. So I think it's about having that diversity as well in all the different kinds of communication that I do.
Look how varied your day sounds, and you started off by saying, "Oh, I don't have a typical day," and I think that's such a fascinating thing. Having a career that's always constantly changing, always having to solve new problems. I think uncertainty is kind of what brings interest to life. So, always having things to kind of think about to school sounds really fascinating. Sounds all amazing. And I also love particularly how you really enjoy reaching out and sharing more about materials, because even I didn't really know much about career. I've only heard a few people kind of say, "Oh, I'm interested in material science." Because I feel like at school, the kind of vocational careers, the general subjects. You don't really know these very niche parts of different parts of science. So it's really nice that you're going out and getting more people interested, so that more people are thinking of it as a career, because it's definitely a really rewarding career to go down. So thank you so much. This is a bit of a difficult question, but you said that you really like to use your for science communication. So how would you describe your research on atomic scale manipulation for a beginner?
Yeah, so I've talked a bit about the fact I have a system that I work on. And this system is something called a focused ion beam. So that's basically we have a metal at the top of a large column, and we can heat that up, and we basically produce a stream of ions. We can then use different fields to manipulate the ions and isolate a really pure ion stream that we have. So we know exactly what's in that down to the isotope. So we have a very pure beam there. But what my system then does is we can use a shutter to really fast, really quickly shutter that beam, and we can implant a single ion. And what is different about this system to other systems is then we can detect that we have implanted this one single ion. And that's using electrons that are ejected when you have this implantation. So if you think about ion implantation, it's a bit like if you chuck a cricket ball into a ball pit. So it kind of goes in and some of the things come out. So that's what happens when we do it. And because we've been really precise and very accurate about what kind of ion we have, we also then have a precision as to where we put it. So we're very precise as to where this particular ion is. Now, what we can do is then we can put them into an array, so a kind of, a grid, and they potentially will be the next kind of quantum computers in the future. So we can do things like create these quantum computers. But also what we can do is we can draw things in these ions. So we can, if potentially, for example, someone's measuring current through a bar, a very small bar, like a small device, electronic device, we can go in and we can also add a new material into that mix and see how that changes the way that device works. So this is all done on a really small localized scale. So it will change the way the current interacts with that material in a different way compared to if we did it over the entire surface of the sample. So yeah, that's how we kind of do that sort of nanoscale materials kind of doping, we call it, as ion implantation on a small scale. And that's, yeah, sort of the kind of new quantum computers, but also looking at other materials and how we can look and change them on the really small scale.
Oh, so exciting. And I think it's always really interesting to consider how things work at such a small scale and the amount of precision that has to go into it. But then it has so many applications from quantum computing to that measurement. And I think it's just so fascinating how things small scale behave so differently to the normal world. I think you explained it really eloquently, using the different analogies and stuff. So it will definitely allow listeners to kind of understand no matter what level of understanding. So, concluding questions. What would you say are the key takeaways of your course? Key takeaways.
Of my career. Yeah, so I think I've already mentioned it before, is kind of never stop learning. So and also kind of push yourself a little bit. So for me, a couple of years back, I was working with this plasma deposition, working with graphene. That was really interesting. But I was ready for my next challenge. And, it was a bit of a jump, a bit of a leap of faith into it was quite a different area of research that the kind of this system was in. And I think for me, it was about believing in myself and putting myself out there. I saw it come up and I was like, well, I don't fit everything that they want, but actually I do fit a lot of them. And what I don't have, I can learn because, I do have belief in kind of how I've created my career. So I think that for me, that was the most important thing, was to kind of push myself, take that leap. But then also, yeah, when I get here, I really, continued to learn. During COVID, for example, I taught myself LabVIEW and MATLAB, because that was an area that I knew that I didn't have much expertise in. Was actually, I don't have in chemistry. Back when I was at university, we didn't have kind of any coding experience at all. We didn't learn about coding. Coding was something that people in maths and maybe a bit of physics did, but for us that was not an issue, kind of not something we needed to learn. And as in my PhD, we had one person who could do a bit of coding, but we kind of left it to him a bit. And I was like, actually, if it's my data, I know the data the best. It would be better if I could do some of that coding or some of that processing. So I think that's the bit that I would always do, is do keep learning and do keep recognizing what bits you don't know, and maybe you'll be challenged and need to learn a bit to kind of answer that question. But that's the bit that kind of the big takeaway for me, is that never stop learning, and kind of always look into new avenues as well, because you never know what's on the horizon. Kind of don't get stuck in a small area. Be free.
That was such a lovely. I love how you talked about risk taking, always keeping your options open, because you never know what the next thing will be, and having faith in yourself. I think that was definitely the right thing to do, because your career sounds so fascinating. When I read your description, I thought, well, you've done so much. You've gone from plasma detection to nanoscience. It just seemed like such a wide, broad career. So I was so fascinated by all your different experiences. So now we'll move on to the final kind of section of our interview. And we've heard some lovely insight into your education, how you got to your career, and your everyday life. And that just sounds amazing. So now I was wondering, do you have any advice for the next generation, for our young listeners, how they can get into a career in STEM, particularly quantitative material science, because that's a really fascinating field. So what would you recommend for high school students to get involved in?
Yeah, I think it's about being aware that there's more than just the core subjects. But I think, you do have to, when you're at school, you do have to focus on those core subjects, because they will really be the bedrock on which you build everything on. And that's how you will flourish, is kind of really focusing on getting them kind of solid, and focus on those. But I think there's also so much out there now where you can read around, quantum. Quantum is a word now that is often in, articles and different kind of media out there. And it's a lot more accessible. So, I read the other weekend there was a quantum comic there was kind of in the UK, and there's a quantum card game out there. So I think it's about engaging in quantum in different ways. I think that's really important, and being aware of quantum. But also I think that, there are more articles out there, and it's also about reading it and then not taking everything at face value. Any good kind of article about these sorts of things will have references, and it's about being critical of that as well. So starting your critical thinking, being like, okay, this is really interesting, maybe I'll have a look at the university press release on this, because a university press release will be different from a kind of a broadsheet article on quantum. Most of them will come from a press release first, so that will have a different take on it, and it might be a little bit less accessible, but it might give you a bit more of a focus on the science, of the core science. Reading a journal at high school, they could be quite intense. They're quite intense for me to read, so I wouldn't necessarily spend all your time doing that. But it's about being critical and looking at different avenues and weighing up different articles, and kind of like I think just having a general interest generally, and being read around is absolutely one of the best things you can do. And you don't have to read into every single article out there in quantum. You don't have to be a quantum expert. I think it's about having exposure to it and understanding kind of the implications of it. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to understand the core quantum mechanics principles that there are out there, because I don't understand half of the core quantum principles out there. But I think it's about being aware and getting yourself kind of in those circles, and getting your brain thinking critically about those materials or those quantum things, and realizing kind of the scope of quantum and the scope of materials. And that will allow you to be able to make decisions about what you want to do in the future, because it's very difficult to make those decisions if you don't have all the options out there. So that would be my kind of rambling advice to someone.
So I think that sounds perfect, because you talked about how not every general article might be accessible, but you talked about looking at unconventional, a wide array of different ways to kind of learn. I think that really resonates with me, because of course, having that critical thinking and looking through the article is a really important skill to developing your abilities and your learning, because like I said, you should always take everything with a pinch of salt. Make sure you check your references, because particularly in the field of quantum field, there's a lot of misinformation in the general broadsheet newspapers, and maybe in tabloids if they've had information into the field of quantum, and might make it seem quite speculative, really exciting, because we do normally usually associate the word quantum with something like really foreign, exciting, and quantum, but I think, like you said, is being really well read of every single part of quantum, and not being an expert, just willing to learn and look at new experiences. So that was really great to hear, such a lovely answer, because it's all about just taking new experiences, trying to find knowledge in whatever you for, be it in journals or even in comics and games that you mentioned, which are also really exciting, especially for a younger audience. So moving on, this is a really important question. How do you believe that we can improve diversity within the world of STEM?
I think for me, I take that as being kind of for myself, I love being visible and vocal about kind of my personal diversity, and that allows other people to see kind of that as a potential role for the future. So I think that there's a lot of, when we grow up, we see people in roles that we resonate with, and we're like, oh, I could be that then. So I think it's about giving people kind of those roles models kind of from an early age, and being like, oh, that could be me. So I think we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. So I think that it's about, for myself, kind of, I am a woman, and I have dyslexia, so I'm very vocal about that. I'm a bisexual. I'm BAME, and all these things, all this whole package to myself. The more I bring my whole self to my work, the better I am. And I think about being vocal about that is also really important. So kind of making sure that people know that actually, in being my whole self and bringing all my diversities to work, that's really good for the university. But then kind of that's looking forward, and then also looking to the youth, being like, look, you're like me, or you're like the diverse workplace we are. This is a route for you too. You'll be welcome here, and you will add to the great community that is the scientists and is the quantum world in the future. For me, I just want to really put myself out there so that other people can see that there is some diversity already in science, and no matter where you kind of come from, that science, if that resonates with you and that's something you want to do and that's a passion of yours, you can do that. So that's my personal way in which I do it. There are many other ways of doing it, but that's the way that I like to see my personal outward to the other people.
Yeah, I totally agree with the kind of aspect of growing being a role model. So I've always felt that seeing someone who looks like you, who is like you, just gives you such assurance and a feeling that you can make it, because there's been someone in the past thinking it, and it's really nice to have that sort of role model and inspiration to look up to. So that's why it's really nice to chat with you and to learn more about how as young girls we can get involved and forge our path. So thank you so much. That was such a lovely interview. It was really fascinating picking up all your experiences from that observatory experience all the way to your fascinating research. So thank you so much. It was lovely to hear your journey.